Before we start exciting stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share it with your friends. Also, please, can you tell me where and what time you are watching? The Echoes of Black Hollow. The village of Black Hollow was a place most people only whispered about, nestled deep within a forest that seemed perpetually cloaked in mist. It was the kind of place where shadows loomed larger than life, and every creak of a tree branch felt like the groan of some unseen ancient entity. No one ever went there intentionally, and those who stumbled upon it never returned, at least not as they once were. This story has 5 chapters. Chapter 1: The Invitation. When Claire received the letter, she thought it was a joke. The envelope was made of thick yellowed parchment, the kind one might expect to find in a dusty antique shop. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, as though penned by someone in great distress. It read, "To the chosen recipient, your presence is urgently required in Black Hollow. It is a matter of life and death, yours and countless others. Follow the map enclosed. Do not delay." Claire's first instinct was to toss the letter into the trash. But as her eyes scanned the words again, she felt an inexplicable pull, as though the letter had reached deep inside her and wrapped icy fingers around her heart. She unfolded the map, and a strange dizziness overtook her. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her, even in the safety of her small apartment in the city. By the time she realized what she was doing, she was already packing a bag. Chapter 2: The Road to Black Hollow. The journey to Black Hollow was uneventful at first. Claire drove for hours, the radio static crackling like ghostly whispers. The farther she traveled, the more desolate the surroundings became. Gas stations disappeared, and the roads grew narrower and more cracked. Eventually, her GPS lost signal entirely. The forest that surrounded Black Hollow was unlike anything she had ever seen. The trees were unnaturally tall, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the smell of decay. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. By the time she reached the village, the sun had vanished, and an oppressive darkness had settled over everything. The buildings were decrepit, their roofs caving in and windows shattered. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant howl of an animal, or was it something else? Claire parked her car near what appeared to be the town square, though the term felt generous. A single flickering street lamp cast long shadows across the cobblestones. She clutched the letter tightly as she stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" Her words echoed, but no one answered. Chapter 3: The Stranger. Claire hadn't seen him at first, but he had been watching her from the shadows. When he stepped into the dim light, she nearly screamed. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and sunken, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes glinted with a strange, feverish intensity. "You received the letter," he said. It wasn't a question. Claire nodded, clutching her bag tighter. "Who are you? What is this place?" The man's lips twitched into a semblance of a smile. "My name is Elias. This is Black Hollow. You're here because you were chosen." "Chosen for what?" Claire demanded. Elias gestured for her to follow him. "There isn't much time. If you're here, it means the echoes have awakened." "The echoes?" Claire repeated, her stomach tightening. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he led her to a large crumbling mansion at the edge of the village. Its windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. As they stepped inside, Claire was struck by the overwhelming stench of mildew and rot. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating. The foyer was filled with strange symbols scrawled on the walls, their meaning indecipherable. Candles flickered in every corner, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Elias turned to her, his expression grave. "Black Hollow is cursed. The echoes are the remnants of those who once lived here trapped between this world and the next. They feed on fear, and they're growing stronger. Claire's heart pounded. What does that have to do with me? You're the key, Elias said. You're the only one who can end this. Chapter 4. The Awakening. As night fell, the village came alive with an unnatural energy. Shadows darted across the streets, and strange whispers filled the air. Claire could feel them, the echoes lurking just out of sight. Their presence was palpable, a cold dread that seeped into her very bones. Elias handed her a worn leather-bound book. This contains the ritual. You must perform it before midnight. Claire flipped through the pages, her hands shaking. The text was written in a language she didn't understand, but the diagrams were horrifyingly clear. The ritual required blood, her blood, and the sacrifice of something she held dear. I can't do this, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I don't even know what I'm doing. If you don't, Elias said, the echoes will consume everything. They'll spread beyond Black Hollow, and no one will be safe. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the echoes grew bolder. Claire could see their twisted forms in the shadows, their hollow eyes gleaming with malevolence. They whispered her name, their voices a cacophony of pain and despair. Summoning every ounce of courage, Claire began the ritual. She followed the diagrams, reciting the incantations as best she could. The air around her crackled with energy, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. Chapter 5. The Final Confrontation. As the final words left her lips, the echoes erupted from the shadows. They were grotesque, their bodies twisted and malformed, their faces frozen in eternal screams. They swarmed around her, their touch icy and suffocating. Claire held her ground, clutching the book tightly. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and a blinding light filled the room. The echoes shrieked, their voices merging into one agonized wail. But then the light faltered. Something was wrong. Eli stumbled forward, his face contorted in pain. They're too strong, he gasped. You need to give more. Something you love. Claire's mind raced. She had nothing with her, no mementos, no keepsakes. But then she realized what Elias meant. The sacrifice wasn't an object. It was her life. Tears streaming down her face, Claire stepped into the center of the glowing symbols. She closed her eyes and whispered a final prayer. The light intensified, engulfing everything. The echoes screamed one last time before they were silenced forever. Epilogue. When Claire opened her eyes, she was lying on the forest floor. The sun was rising, and the village of Black Hollow was gone. There was no sign of Elias or the mansion. The letter, the book, everything had vanished. She felt different, lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from her. But she also knew she would never be the same. Black Hollow had taken something from her, something she could never get back. As she walked back to her car, the forest seemed less oppressive, the air less heavy. But in the distance, she thought she heard a whisper, a faint echo carried on the wind. And she knew the curse of Black Hollow was not truly gone. Before starting the second story, please do subscribe and like this video and comment what time you are watching. Thanks. The Curse of Ravenwood Forest. The legend of Ravenwood Forest was one that every local in the small town of Windmere knew by heart. Parents used it to scare their children into obedience, and teenagers dared each other to venture into its depths. It was said that those who entered the forest after dark never returned, and those who did were forever changed. No one really believed the stories until the disappearances began. This story has 4 chapters. Chapter 1. The Dare. Come on, Jenna. Are you really going to let a silly story scare you? Ryan teased, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Jenna glared at him, her pride wounded. I'm not scared. It's just stupid. Why would I waste my time? Because, chimed in Melissa, her best friend, it's Halloween and we're supposed to do something spooky. What's spookier than Ravenwood? Jenna hesitated. The thought of stepping into the infamous forest sent shivers down her spine, but she couldn't let her friends see her fear. Fine, she said, feigning nonchalance, let's go. The group of five, Jenna, Ryan, Melissa, and the twins Tom and Katie, set off as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air grew colder and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and decay. As they reached the edge of Ravenwood Forest, an unnatural silence settled over them. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. All right, we'll go in, take a selfie to prove we were here, and then leave, Ryan said, pulling out his phone. Easy peasy, Tom added, though his voice trembled slightly. But as they stepped into the forest, the world seemed to shift. The trees were taller and denser than they appeared from the outside, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The path they had planned to follow was gone, replaced by a maze of shadows and tangled roots. Chapter 2. The First Scene. I think we should turn back, Katie said, her voice barely above a whisper. We've only been here 5 minutes, Ryan retorted, but even he sounded unsure. As they ventured deeper, a faint sound reached Jenna's ears, a soft rhythmic tapping like footsteps. She froze, her heart pounding. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling. Hear what? Melissa replied, her eyes darting nervously. The tapping grew louder, joined by the faintest hint of a whisper. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. Jenna's breathing quickened. This isn't funny, Tom said, his face pale. Who's doing that? No one, Katie whispered, clutching her brother's arm. We need to leave now. But the forest wasn't letting them go. The path behind them had vanished, replaced by more trees and shadows. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. Chapter 3. The Watcher. There's no signal, Ryan muttered, holding his phone up. We'll have to find our way out the old-fashioned way. Jenna nodded, though she wasn't sure which direction to take. Every tree looked the same, and the darkness seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. As they walked, the whispers returned, louder and closer. I'm not imagining this, Melissa said, her voice breaking. Someone's following us. It's not someone, Jenna whispered, her stomach churning with dread. Ahead of them, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was a void, a featureless abyss that seemed to suck in all light. The group froze, their terror rendering them speechless. The figure tilted its head as if studying them, before raising a skeletal hand and pointing directly at Jenna. A guttural growl emanated from the darkness and the creature began to move toward them. Run, Ryan screamed. They bolted, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and shifting to block their path. The whispers turned into screams, and the tapping became a thunderous pounding. Chapter 4. The Truth Revealed. Jenna stumbled, falling to the ground. Melissa stopped to help her, but the others kept running. The figure was closer now, its movements jerky and unnatural. Jenna's eyes met the void where its face should have been, and a wave of nausea washed over her. Images flashed through her mind, screaming faces, twisted bodies, and a darkness that consumed everything. It's the forest, Melissa whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's alive. It's feeding on us. How do we stop it? Jenna asked, her voice barely audible. We don't, Melissa said. We just run. They got to their feet and ran blindly, the forest twisting and shifting around them. The figure's growls grew louder, but then suddenly it stopped. The whispers ceased, and the forest became eerily still. Jenna and Melissa turned to find themselves alone. The others were gone, and the figure was nowhere in sight. But they could feel it watching, its presence lingering like a cold hand on their shoulders. Epilogue. Jenna and Melissa emerged from the forest at dawn, their clothes torn and faces pale. The townspeople found them wandering the streets, muttering about shadows and whispers. The others were never found, and Jenna knew they never would be. The forest had claimed them. From that day on, Jenna avoided the edge of Ravenwood, but every now and then she would hear the faint tapping, a whisper on the wind, and she knew the forest wasn't done with her. The Haunting of Ashwick Lighthouse. Ashwick Lighthouse stood at the edge of a jagged cliff, its light a beacon for lost sailors and a warning for the reckless. For decades it had guided ships safely through treacherous waters, but it held a darker reputation among the townsfolk. They whispered of shadows moving within its walls, of screams carried on the wind, and of those who ventured inside never returning. This story has 5 chapters. Chapter 1: The Keeper's Arrival. Evelyn Barrett arrived in Ashwick on a stormy autumn evening, the salty air heavy with rain. A professional historian and writer, she had come to document the history of the lighthouse for a book she was working on. The town's librarian, Mrs. Harding, had arranged for her to stay at the keeper's house, a small stone building attached to the lighthouse. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" Mrs. Harding asked, handing Evelyn the keys. Her wrinkled face was lined with concern. Evelyn smiled. "I'll be fine. I'm more worried about the storm knocking the power out." "It's not the storm you should worry about," Mrs. Harding muttered, her voice almost lost in the howling wind. Before Evelyn could ask what she meant, the old woman turned and hurried back to her car. As Evelyn stepped into the keeper's house, a chill ran down her spine. The air was damp and cold, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. The lighthouse loomed over her, its windows dark and unwelcoming. She shook off her unease and set about unpacking. Chapter 2: The First Night. The first night was uneventful, though Evelyn slept fitfully. She woke several times to the sound of the storm raging outside, but once she thought she heard something else, a faint knocking, as if someone were tapping on the walls of the lighthouse. She dismissed it as her imagination and fell back asleep. The next morning she began her research, poring over old records and diaries left by previous keepers. One name stood out: Henry Blackwell, the last keeper before the lighthouse was automated. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the records hinted at strange occurrences during his tenure. As the day wore on, Evelyn decided to explore the lighthouse itself. The spiral staircase was narrow and steep, the air growing colder with each step. At the top, the lantern room offered a stunning view of the ocean, but something about the space felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Chapter 3: Shadows and Whispers. That night the knocking returned, louder this time. Evelyn's heart raced as she sat up in bed, clutching the covers. The sound seemed to come from inside the lighthouse. Summoning her courage, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the lighthouse door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing the spiral staircase bathed in eerie shadows. She called out, but her voice echoed back, unanswered. As she climbed the stairs, the knocking grew fainter, replaced by whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She paused, shining her flashlight around, but saw nothing. At the top, the lantern room was empty, save for the faint smell of smoke. Evelyn descended quickly, her unease growing. Back in the keeper's house, she locked the door and resolved to leave first thing in the morning. Chapter 4: The Keeper's Journal. Unable to sleep, Evelyn decided to read more about Henry Blackwell. She found his journal tucked away in a drawer, the pages yellowed with age. The entries began innocuously enough but grew increasingly erratic. July 15, 1903, strange noises in the night, perhaps the wind. August 3rd, 1903, saw a figure in the lantern room. No one was there when I checked. September 10th, 1903, they're in the walls, watching, waiting. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. October 31st, 1903, the light must stay on. It's the only thing keeping them out. A sudden crash interrupted her reading. The sound came from the lighthouse, heart pounding. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously approached the door. Chapter 5: The Light Goes Out. The storm had intensified, and the lighthouse's beam flickered ominously. As Evelyn entered, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. She climbed the staircase, the whispers growing louder with each step. At the top, the lantern was extinguished. Evelyn frantically searched for a way to relight it, but her flashlight flickered and died. She was plunged into darkness. A low growl echoed through the room, and she turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the corner. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its elongated limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally. Evelyn backed away, but the figure moved closer, its whispering voice filling her mind. The light must stay on, it hissed, its voice layered with anguish and malice. In a desperate bid, Evelyn grabbed an oil lamp and struck a match. The flame roared to life, and the figure recoiled, shrieking as it dissolved into the shadows. She hurriedly lit the lantern, and its beam cut through the storm, the oppressive darkness lifting. Epilogue. Evelyn left Ashwick the next morning, her face pale and her hands trembling. She never spoke of what she had seen, but her book, The Haunting of Ashwick Lighthouse, became a bestseller. The townsfolk noted that the lighthouse's light never flickered again, and no one dared to ask why. Years later, a new keeper took up residence. On his first night, he thought he heard a faint knocking, but when he went to investigate, he found nothing except the lingering scent of smoke in the air.